It's hard. I mean, it's hard, and these are conversations that I would have with my editor and probably with my lawyer. That a person is giving me this information, and it's a decision I feel like bigger than me. But of course, I would, if somebody was giving me information like this, you would promise to keep their identity confidential. That's how journalists work and get so much of the information that we have. Does anybody want to jump?
Emily, does it concern you as a journalist that there is a significant motive here to damage the governor coming from this material that you have?
I mean, most definitely. I think you can kind of presume the motive if you know the source, but if you don't know the actual source, it's a little, because if you're just getting anonymous documents, you kind of, once you give away your documents, you don't really know what actual stories will be found in the documents. So I mean, we can presume that there is an overriding motive, but there are possibly other stories that would come out. I mean, it would be a series of hypothetical conversations probably with this intermediary about what she expected the terms to be,
right,
and then more hypothetical conversations with editors and attorneys for the publications before any agreements were made whatsoever. I mean, I can see an agreement being made that I would not name the intermediary. I would in no way ever agree to not do any sort of fact-checking on the documents.
Exactly.
Like you wouldn't take the documents at face value. Some of these are corroboratable, or you would be able to find through source networks to show that actually, these were complaints that had been lodged 6 years ago or other things like that. I mean, it's
everybody always has
question.
Yeah, it's not an easy question, and everybody has a motive when they're giving a journalist information. There's a motive for everything. But you made the point that I was just about to make too. A lot of the information, if there are police reports, you can go back and try to find them, and you can try to corroborate some of that information on your own, which is very important.
Sure. Well, I think that's very risky. I mean, whatever promise of confidentiality Larry makes, he needs to keep because it becomes a binding contract, and there's also probably greater standards issues involved with promises of confidentiality. I mean, it's one thing to breach a contract you make with a source. It's another thing to jeopardize the reputation that the institution has in terms of keeping confidentiality. So I think there's a lot on that end, but I think it'd be risky to make any agreement not to authenticate or confirm the accuracy of what's in those materials. Again, reputationally, standards-wise, but frankly, from the legal end, you are potentially repeating things that may not be true. And there's, I think, a greater risk in the context of matrimonial cases. Lawyers will know there's this fair report privilege that allows a press organization to report on court cases, official proceedings. And if candor reflects New York, there's at least one case out there where calls into question whether the fair report privilege can apply to sealed matrimonial cases. So you may find yourself repeating allegations that you don't know the source, you haven't confirmed the accuracy of them, and potentially be on the hook for a false statement coming out of that.
I have done it rarely, but I have done it.
Mm-hmm. The general procedure, though, is to bring in somebody else?
Yeah. Ordinarily, you would do that. I've reported, as I said, rarely, but because I've been with the organization as long as I have, there's a track record and there's a certain amount of trust that they've invested in me to know the information, to know it's true, and say, well, if you know it, go with it. That's happened a handful of times, but in most circumstances where I've been placed in a situation where I have information from a source, I will volunteer the source to the managing editor or to the news director or to both. But under those circumstances, I'm willing to do it. But there's certain cases, certain things were so sensitive that I just asked them to trust me, and we did it that way.
We're always supposed to have at least two, although what I've found is sometimes you can have one ironclad source, or you can have 40 sources and not have the information right. So that rule doesn't always work the way Watergate would like it to. But we generally run the source by a very top editor. You would never just give it to anybody on the desk or something. You really have to protect your sources at all costs, and I think we go to great lengths to do that. So that's kind of the way the system works.
Was that a state case in Minnesota some years ago that held that it was a contract, that a source relationship is a contract between an individual and the news organization, not the reporter, but with the news organization? We've always been very careful at our shop to maintain that a reporter needs to let an editor know who that confidential source is, because we view it that we're all going to maintain that confidentiality, because after all, if the reporter is hauled in and pushed to reveal a source, it's the organization that's paying for the lawyer, so we need to be a party to the conversation as well. Beth Lobel, you having any consternation about where we are so far with this? Is your client on solid ground so far?
Well, I agree with what Brian said with the approach. And one other thing I would add is that we are cautious to make an agreement for absolute confidentiality. That's one thing I think a lot of times sources might be okay with merely not naming them in connection with the information in the piece or the broadcast. And we have to our reporters have to get very high permission from President of the News Division to be able to guarantee absolute confidentiality, because it can mean not only they're going to jail for contempt, which they might love the First Amendment and be willing to do, but it could mean us paying millions of dollars in contempt fines. We've done it, but it's a really thought out decision. Now, in this instance, given the political ramifications, it might be an appropriate time where they would be willing to do that. So I just think we try to perhaps have some pushback, and there's a difference again with the source. What do they understand? Do they mean we never will reveal them, even in the face of an order from a court?
Well, there is, and in particular in this circumstance. I mean, they can't exclude particular news outlets or particular reporters based on the content of their speech. So in this case, if Jenny Journeau has come out and reported something that the governor doesn't like, that's viewpoint discrimination. She can't be excluded on that ground. Of course, politicians aren't required to speak to everybody all the time, but in this case, I think there would be recourse. There's a legal recourse. Frankly, the way we would deal with it in the first instance, though, is on the editorial side. I think you'd get a letter or a call to whomever from AP's top editorial staff to the governor's office or the mayor's office, whatever it might be. And I think most times that can do the trick.
A letter that you would send?
Or a phone call, putting pressure. I mean, I don't think it makes the governor look good in this situation that he's now punishing an individual reporter who exposed some of his misconduct.
Reporters, what do you do? Have you been closed out of something that you intended to get to?
You roll on, for television, you roll on it. You roll on everything, and then you have sometimes, depending on what the story is, a better story later that you were forced out of a news conference or weren't allowed in or whatever the case may be. But like our policy at CBS is our camera guys know you always continue rolling and try to get your way in. And if the police come, you're respectful, but it'll make its way on television later tonight.
What about this notion of collegiality of reporters and saying, well, if you keep Andrea Grimes out, Emily Saul is not going to go into that press conference either. Does that ever really happen in real life?
I don't think that would happen. I think just because the optics are so bad of him barring the reporter who wrote a story that was not in his political favor, you would just end up with every other paper, television crew, everything in the city basically saying that he had barred this reporter from this conference. It would just it would, I mean, people wouldn't not go, they just would go and then report that a colleague had not been allowed. And
NJ, if Andrea's and her crew are kept out, are you going to share the tape? Sorry, it's not tape anymore, is it?
No, it isn't, but I'm making that mistake all the time.
Yeah.
I think that's a very noble thing to do, and I like to think that I'm capable of nobility in the field. I've never been in that situation where someone's been excluded from an event that everyone else has attended. We've had situations, Andrea knows about these situations, where, the equipment fails, or somebody's mic cable doesn't work. My photographers have gone out to the truck, brought back another mic cable here, you can borrow this. It's not like the old days where, they'd slash each other's tires so they couldn't get to the story. I mean, it's not like that, and not like the 70s anymore. It happens in different ways nowadays. But in that, if you had more time, but no, I mean, I think that's a great idea. I don't know if it would have occurred to me to do that. But, as a practical matter, would I have a compunction about doing it? No, I wouldn't.
Well, in this case, the governor...
It's not, by the way, I don't think that's a decision I could have made unilaterally.
Right.
I should add, and I think I would have to consult my people about that.
Mm-hmm.